Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic, creative, and interesting side of the spectrum. My name's John Rogers, I'm your host. I'm a journalist based out in Reykjavik, Iceland. Today, we're talking about two games that have been in some way controversial or divisive in how they were received. Both are big productions. Both have been heavily featured in the media, but both have somehow, to some degree, come to be thought of as games that were overlooked or underrated, which seems kind of hard to believe when we're talking about games of this size. Later on in the podcast, I'm going to talk about the Mad Max tie-in game. But first, I'm talking about the cinematic spectacle that is Detroit Become Human. This game is one that I became aware of relatively recently when I got a PS4 and was just browsing the store. I noticed it because it was on sale and picked it up for I think £8, which seems like quite the bargain given the amount of gameplay that is in the game. It was released in 2018 by Quantic Dream and written and directed by David Cage. I hadn't heard of David Cage before, but it turns out that he is quite a controversial figure. He's a champion and kind of auteur of decision-based narrative games. They're not traditional. They are games in which you choose forking paths that your character can take that have plot consequences. Gameplay, in the traditional sense of the word, is reduced and narrative is pushed to the front. And Detroit Become Human is his most ambitious project to date. Before, he made a game called Heavy Rain, and he made a game called Beyond Two Souls. I haven't played either, so Detroit Become Human is my first David Cage game. It's my first game with a lot of quick-time events, QTEs, which you might be familiar with already. They were featured in some arcade games in the past, and in Resident Evil 4, I think there were a few. It's when something happens, let's say in Resident Evil 4, you're in combat, a zombie grabs you, and you have to basically mash the X button to shake it off. Detroit Become Human, all of the action sequences in the game are QTEs. That means if you are chasing someone on foot, you have a 2-second or 3-second window to hit circle to run left, square to run right, that kind of thing. If you don't do anything, it picks for you. And the choices that you make matter. You lose a suspect, you catch a suspect, and then you have dialogue. You can usually choose from 4 options. You can be calming, you can be confrontational, things like this. It's not usually very specific dialogue choices. It's more that you're choosing the tone of the response. And depending on what you pick, life or death events unfold. You control 3 characters throughout the game. You control Connor, who's an android, who's a police officer, and he's investigating a series of unusual events as the partner of a human police officer named Hank. You also control Kara, who is a freshly repaired household assistant model of android who is returning to a somewhat troubled home, to say the least. And finally, you control Marcus, who is the kind of personal assistant and carer for a respected artist who pretty soon finds himself on the run. And all of these 3 characters have huge branching possibilities for their stories and outcomes that are decided by the choices that you make. That's the positive part of the game, when you really get to choose what happens and direct your character through this complex branching narrative that can have all kinds of outcomes. The negative side of it is that often these events are decided by whether or not you succeed in a QuickTime event, which means that you better be ready to quickly punch in buttons to yank your controller up and down, although you can turn that off. I did turn that off because it's such an unreliable control mechanism that on my first playthrough I lost 2 of my main characters and was a little bereft because I wasn't able to yank the controller, or my inputs weren't red, or my reactions weren't fast enough. But the 3 characters are moving through a kind of a pivotal moment in history in the Isaac Asimov sense of the question of where artificial intelligence ends and where life begins. It's a common sci-fi question and scenario that we've seen explored many times, but this game takes another run at it. And the first thing that I noticed about this game is how luxuriously produced it is. Every character is motion captured, voice acted, and every environment is kind of photogenic, cinematic, and absolutely beautiful. As you're moving through this world, it's one of the most convincing environments I've ever seen in a game. It feels a level up from pretty much everything. They were able to do this probably because the range of movements that you can carry out in a game and gameplay is reduced compared to, say, open world games where you can climb everything, interact with everything. And the level of interaction that you have in this game is pretty minimal. An icon flashes up when you can interact with something, say a magazine or a painting on the wall or something on the ground or a person. You can hold down a button to scan the environment for these interaction points. Most interactions will result in a cutscene where you have a conversation, or a QuickTime event when you have to quickly carry out a sequence of commands to continue in the story. And in that sense, it really feels like an interactive movie as much as a game. It's somewhere between, I guess people call these visual novels, but this is definitely an interactive science fiction film that you get to kind of lead your characters through. It had a movie-sized budget. It had a €30 million budget, and it has actors in it that you might recognise. I was wondering for half the game, like, where do I know Hank from? He's the kind of drunken, problematic partner of the cold, robotic, perfect-seeming Connor, who you control. And Hank is he's like a kind of long-haired alcoholic, etc. Kind of a cliche of a character, but very well acted by Clancy Brown, who it turns out is I was recognising him from the Highlander movie. He plays the bad guy in the original Highlander movie, and he's been in lots of things. Also, Lance Henriksen is in the film, a kind of a beloved sci-fi actor who played Bishop in Aliens alongside Sigourney Weaver. So the cast is great. The central cast is great. I did recognise the actor who played Marcus, Jesse something. I think he was in The Butler. He's been in a few things. But this luxurious, extravagantly produced game, clearly, I mean, the ambition of it is clearly to redraw the relationship between games and films and to try and find a middle ground between these two formats. And this game carries that out with some success. I became very invested in the characters. I became hugely invested in the outcomes. And so I played through several times. Not from the beginning, because at the end of each chapter you see a flow chart with the outcomes that you achieved or chose and all of the locked outcomes that you could have achieved. And they're all shown with a lock symbol, so you don't get spoilers from literally looking at the flowcharts, but you do get a sense of how widely the plot could have diverged from the results that you got. There are checkpoints in the chapters, and after your run through, you can either play again from the start, or you can choose the checkpoint that you want to continue from. You have to play the whole game from that checkpoint forward if you want to see all of the chapters that you missed. So you can't kind of hopscotch through chapters changing individual outcomes. That doesn't work. But I went back, I think, to chapter 7, about halfway through the story, where I had lost a character, and I replayed the second half of the story, changed a lot of outcomes on my way, and saw some really different results from the ones that I first got. It showed the ambition of the script and of the narrative design, And I went back and played the second half 2 times after my first playthrough, and saw some vastly divergent outcomes, and was very impressed by the scope of the story and the decision making process that's offered to the player. You can choose how you want characters to develop. You can decide if you want the police robot to kind of stay on the straight and narrow to some degree, without wishing to give away too many spoilers. You can decide if you want Kara to be kind of squeaky clean, or if you want her to act in a more self-interested way. And all of these micro choices that you make along the way affect how other characters think of you, and that in turn affects the outcomes that you get. I don't know how well I'm explaining it, but let's just say that everything you do in this game really matters, and characters live or die based on your decisions, and that's a lot to take in. If it feels like I'm dancing around the game a little bit here, it's because I am. You can't really discuss this game without getting into spoilers pretty rapidly. So I think for the first time in the podcast series, I'm going to have a little spoiler break now. I'm going to come back to this point from the future and tell you where you can skip to if you want to skip the spoiler section of the Detroit Become Human conversation, and move on to the Mad Max review part of the podcast. So this is me from the future telling you where to skip to. Go to 18 minutes and 50 seconds and not before. And now we're going to delve into a little bit of story stuff, and I hope you'll rejoin me at the end of the show for the second half. Okay, cheers. So, now we're alone and we can talk about Detroit Become Human without having to worry about spoilers. This game's story is intense. I mean, I guess if you're listening to this, you've probably played the game or have no intention of doing so, and therefore don't care about spoilers. But Connor is a police robot, and you can choose between two branches for him. He can either stay on the side of the humans, or he can become a deviant. Marcus, the household robot, at the very start of the game is framed for a crime, destroyed, and crawls out of the wreckage, going on to become the leader of the android revolution. And for him, you can choose whether you want him to be like a Dalai Lama or a Che Guevara. Like, he can be a violent revolutionary, or he can be a peaceful protester. And he will ultimately come into conflict or confluence with Connor. Kara is someone that's moving through this scenario rather than shaping events. And based on what you decide for her, I mean, she was the character that I cared about the most, and the character that I lost on my first playthrough. She was just executed with a shotgun because I didn't hit square fast enough, and I just sat staring at the screen like it was the Red Wedding. Seriously, I couldn't. I almost quit. I kind of sat there for a bit, and then I just played through the second half in a kind of a disinterested fashion, choosing that Marcus would be the Dalai Lama. He would lose most of his people, but have a successful outcome where the humans respect him because he starts to sing a song when he's about to be shot down on camera with some journalists, and public opinion turns his way, and the Hillary Clinton-esque president, who is called President Warren, so she's like an amalgam of Democrat wish lists, a female president who's more Warren than Clinton. She calls off the police. Marcus lives. Androids are recognized. But then I thought I have to see what happens to Kara. Her story was the most compelling. It was like an on-the-run story. At the very start of Kara's story, she's taken into a violent household with a violent alcoholic father who has destroyed her in the past and who beats his daughter. And she's the first character that you control who breaks her programming, becomes a deviant, wipes out the dad, and goes on the run with the daughter. And so you're on the run with a child, nowhere to go. You have to find a change of clothes out of her android clothes. You have to find somewhere for them to sleep, whether by stealing money and staying in a motel or by staying honest and staying in a squat. This in turn shapes how you're seen by the child, Alice, and it shapes where you go next. Kara's story for me was the most interesting. I mean, playing a cold robot cop guy and playing a revolutionary robot guy felt more cliched and less interesting to me than playing a female android on the run. And when I came back to play as Kara again, the outcomes that I got were hugely divergent. Like, there's one outcome that I got where I escaped from the shotgun guy, went on the run, almost got to a bus terminal to get a bus to Canada, but then was caught by the police at a key divergent point in the plot and put into a android camp. And androids are being killed en masse there, so they kind of make the androids take off their external appearance, their skin, because androids can just become a kind of a white blank canvas, and then they're lined up in a death camp, basically. So that's something that Detroit Become Human does. Like, Marcus literally uses lines from Martin Luther King, and Kara can literally become a kind of a Schindler's List sort of Holocaust victim. And so the game picks up these weighty historical moments and just tosses them into the mix. And there were points at which I thought the writing in this game isn't strong enough to hold the weight of the historical references that are being thrown into the mix here. This sort of slightly cheesy, slightly cliched science fiction plot is not well written enough to demand these kind of weighty references. And I felt a little queasy at some points. I mean, some of the writing is quite bad, especially for Alice, the child, who she kind of outright says things that a child wouldn't say. It's like the underlying psychology, like, why did my dad never love me? It's not something that a child would say. The child wouldn't conceive of things that way. That would be the underlying psychological makeup that led to her behaving another way. So I felt that David Cage's writing was often did the classic mistake of telling rather than showing, if you know what I mean, and was psychologically shallow, which made using these weighty historical moments more problematic. So Kara can go into the death camp. I wasn't satisfied with that outcome, and so I played her again and managed to get her to the bus terminal, and then I managed to get her to a river crossing, and I got her over to Canada, but I lost the child and I lost the kind of the friend that she picked up on the way. And so my third playthrough, I used a guide. I managed to navigate through the bus terminal and got all three, Kara, Alice the child, and Luther, the android she picks up along the way, into Canada. I had to sacrifice a minor character to do so, but it's as close to ideal as I managed to get. I turned Connor into a deviant who helps out Marcus. I turned Connor into a kind of a Terminator 2-esque kind of RoboCop on the third playthrough. So I explored the options of what you can do with Connor. Marcus, I played as Dalai Lama, and on my last playthrough, I played as Che Guevara. And really, I was left after these three playthroughs thinking, if there are so many endings to these stories, does the story have an ending at all? But ultimately, I enjoyed the game a lot. I think that the detail and vividness of the environment of Detroit in 2038, or whenever it is amazing. It's an achievement. I think it's a flawed masterpiece. I would recommend playing it. I think it's like a sort of 7 to 10 hour playthrough, depending on which characters you keep alive. I've probably spent 20 plus hours with it by now, and I'm not done. I will play through again. I think I'm going to try and get a ideal ending as close as possible. So I'm going to try that again. I'm probably going to end up cribbing from internet help pages to kind of make the right choices and try and get the ideal ending that I want. But overall, I say Detroit Become Human is original, interesting, arresting, luxuriously produced, well put together, narratively flawed, at times cheesily written, at times historically problematic bundle of game. So that's Detroit Become Human. I hope that this review made sense. I know that I've been rambling and there's a lot to talk about and pack to talking about this game. But that's Detroit Become Human. The second game that I'm going to talk about on this podcast is Mad Max, the 2015 action, adventure, open world, sci-fi tie-in. And I'm very keenly aware that this game in no way really fits the bill for this podcast. Most of the games that I talk about are in some way kind of thoughtful, in some way artistically noteworthy and worthwhile. And I even feel bad saying this now, but the Mad Max game is a kind of a plot light, beat 'em up driving combat game that really, if it's creatively worthwhile, creatively noteworthy, it is in the audio-visual aspect only. I consider myself a Mad Max fan, having watched the first films in my teens, and followed Mad Max and enjoyed all three of the movies. They are plot light, they are action heavy, and they are scenario driven. And the game is no different. The plot doesn't really matter. You're a drifter warrior guy with a car going through a desert that is full of post-apocalyptic violence and horror. You come into combat with some warlord type people. You meet a couple of allies along the way, and it's really not at all about plot. It's not at all about ultimate meaning and outcome. It's just post-apocalyptic, guilty pleasure, brain candy, sci-fi. And as such, the game does a really good job. Movie games have a hard time. They are tied to a universe that has a lore of its own. And Mad Max manages to walk this line of being based very much in the world of Fury Road, but being narratively parallel to it. You don't replay events, but it's set in that world. Red sands, muscle cars, nasty cannibal warlords that want to kill you and eat you, oil being the premium resource. And what the Mad Max game does incredibly well is, first of all, the look of the world. So you're in a post-apocalyptic Australia, driving across what used to be the ocean floor, and you notice as you are moving through this world that people are living in shipwrecks. Habitations are scarce. The people are sort of starving. The world is very cruel. Max himself eats like dog food, and he eats maggots, and he eats all sorts of horrible stuff. When you come across locations, there are often the remains of really gruesome events. There are human skeletons. There are, caged corpses. It's just awful. The whole world is just absolutely awful. But as such, you are Max. You move through this world. You have to find gas. You have to beef up your car. You have to take down outposts that make the area that you're in safer. Take down convoys. So you have car combat where you're ramming and you're kind of beefing up your car so that it has a harpoon so that it can fire flames, that sort of thing. Max himself has to go into bandit out camps and take people out. It's a beat 'em up too, and quite a bone crunching one at that. It's not incredibly complicated. You can punch and block, and that's kind of it at first. But as you beef up Max, you get more abilities. If you string together chain moves, then Max can go into a fury mode where time slows down and he becomes more powerful. You can beef Max up with extra moves like a shoulder charge or like a fury finisher and longer runs of chain hits and that sort of thing. It's kind of engaging. The thing that I admire about this is that it has a gameplay loop in that classic kind of what's become known as the Ubisoft mold, I suppose, where you kind of repeat a gameplay loop to improve the standing of the area. It reminded me of Starlink Battle for Atlas a lot, where you have to control different planets at the same time and achieve a balance of power that allows you to progress. And Mad Max is a bit like that. So you'll take down convoys, you'll take out bases. But what I appreciated about this game is that in Starlink, like the bases that you would liberate were basically kind of like the same, and it's even the same in No Man's Sky, that game that has prided itself on variation. There's basically 3 or 4 different buildings that are just planted identically across many planets, same in Starlink. And in Mad Max, every location is individually designed. So you might go to take out an oil camp and it might be just a small looking building, but as you get inside, you realize that it has an underground labyrinth that you will then have to traverse, take out bad guys, blow up tanks, whatever. But then the next one that you come to is in, let's say, an old oil rig, and you have to find a way in by using your binoculars to identify weaknesses around it, take out snipers before you approach, and then you get there, you come in through a gate, you have to crash through the gate with your car maybe, and then you have to go up the pylons of the oil rig. And then the next one that you come to might be in a grounded ship hull, or it might be built up into, the remains of a pipe structure or something. And so they're never exactly the same in that way that No Man's Sky and Starlink and many, many games suffer from. It feels like the world has kind of been meticulously designed to keep you entertained, and the tasks have too. So whilst there is a gameplay loop with repetitive elements, they've managed to design a world that feels convincingly open and real. As is often the case in open world games, there are story missions and there are just the open world aspect where you roam around, or in this case, you drive around and you pick up bonuses, you talk to people for extra materials, you do a little bit of grind, take down some enemy cars. The currency of the game is called scrap. And the more scrap that you get, the more you can kind of beef up your car with spikes to stop people jumping onto it, or with extra nitro boosts or extra abilities for Max himself. And as such, it's a really enjoyable game. There's like a red sand area, there's like a white chalky area. The landscape changes, the geology changes. The structures that you come across are convincing, and they kind of softly world build. You can pick up historical artifacts such as postcards from before the fall, a little like the vantage points in Horizon Zero Dawn, but they're very late civilization things. So it's like, there'll be like a sign that used to be in a shop that says, "We only accept government vouchers, not cash." Or you'll find a postcard from someone that says, "It felt strange to drive past all of these sheep when we could have eaten them, but all of the animals are so contaminated, we only eat tinned food now. We're eating the tinned food that we used to feed our pet," this kind of thing. And there's also humor to the game. Like there are these war criers that hang in cages in enemy camps and beat drums to whip them up into a frenzy. But if you've kind of taken out all of the enemies, there's just a guy hanging in a cage, and he'll talk to you and say, "So, just you and me then?" And you have these really funny, awkward moments. But for the majority of it, the game's tone is relentlessly bleak, utterly brutal. I mean, the whole game is like a kind of a mass of trigger warnings, I would say, for violence, mutilation, and all of this kind of horrible stuff. It's by no means the thinking game that I usually talk about on this podcast, but I picked it up for £8 in the eShop for PlayStation, and I think I'm already about 15 hours in. I've found it to be compulsive playing. I'm addicted, and so I thought it's only fair to talk about this game, even if it doesn't quite fit the mold of the podcast. So I can recommend Mad Max. It's a really decent open world sci-fi game, car battling, fist fighting, plot light, but just engrossing. Yeah, that's it. That's my review. That's Mad Max. So, for the final part of the show, I'm going to reply to some Twitter comments. If you're not following me on Twitter, I'm at Gaming in the Wild, also on Twitch, also on Instagram, also on Facebook as Gaming in the Wild. So you can follow me on those places, and usually it's Twitter where I ask for comments and questions and reply to them on the show. So let's see what we got. First up is Will C at _Will_C_. And he says, I never played Mad Max. Detroit is a really interesting game, though. It's a really cool experience and thought-provoking. I would agree. I mean, I don't think it's kind of right up there with the kind of the Asimov AI best deep dives into this subject matter. But I do think that it's thought-provoking in another way. It made me think a lot about choice. In the days after I played, I was thinking about micro choices that I make. So I think that the narrative design was the most thought-provoking aspect of it, rather than the AI question. Second up is Jay at _gamingbug_. And he says, I've never played Mad Max, but Detroit is a must-play masterpiece. I can see why you would think so. I really can. The narrative design is something else. Ultimately, the divergent outcomes that you can get, and the way that is all put together, the way that you can kind of get in favor with one character who will then behave differently later, and the pure amount of outcomes, it's noteworthy for that alone. Steve-O the Outlaw at Solidarity Steve says, Detroit Become Human story is great sci-fi and it would make an awesome film. Well, Steve, I think that this is the film, actually. I mean, I can see what you're saying. It could be turned into a blockbuster, but maybe the game is the blockbuster. Lionel Frankenstein at _beardiest. Congratulations on your beard, Lionel. He says, if you go into Detroit not knowing what to expect, I could understand why some would become disappointed. But as a Quantic Dream fan, I loved the game. I think so too. If people are expecting it to be Witcher 3 or Breath of the Wild or some kind of open world classic, or what Cyberpunk 2077 is mooted to be, the narrative storytelling design would be jarring. But I say it's absolutely worth it, yeah. So maybe that's to some degree why it was divisive, because people were maybe expecting something other than the game is. Becca Pride, who is at Adventurer Beck, says, I love Detroit Become Human. I wanted to like Mad Max more. The gameplay is decent and I love the movies, but the bits of dialogue and story were so off-putting for me that I couldn't play more than an hour into it. And I completely understand that. I mean, I kind of had a rule coming into quarantine that I wasn't going to play post-apocalyptic games, and I wasn't going to play psychologically disturbing games. And I do have a problem with kind of dude games, if you know what I mean. And Mad Max is an ultra-violent dude game. You have to give Max a big beard and kind of put armor on this car, and it feels incredibly jarring to me as someone that is in favor of kind of more sensitive narratives and characterizations. This is blunt, retrogressive, masculine muscle car gaming, and I'm with you on that. I have to kind of lock off a part of myself to enjoy it too. Let's see who's next. Lord Shmup, who is at Surreal Rager, says, I love Detroit. I watched my wife play and I enjoyed it. Do you think it had too many routes? It looked like you had to do loads of playthroughs to fulfill all the available sequences. That's a really good question. The narrative tree is dizzying. Ideal outcomes are hard to reach. Small choices can have unforeseen effects. And yes, like the amount of endings is dizzying. It's almost like there is no ending. I touched on that a little bit in the spoiler part of the podcast. As someone that's watched someone play the game, I think you're safe to go and listen to what I had to say about that. Next up is Comfortably Adventurous, who is at ComfortablyADV, who says, I really enjoyed Detroit. Certainly it's a game of style over substance with arguably little actual input and more the appeal of the world and the environment. But what a memorable gaming world to live in, even if for such a short time. I think for most gamers it's going to feel a little weird to have such a kind of small selection of inputs to carry out and such a small amount of control. Like, you can move the characters around for people that are thinking about it. Like, For example, Marcus can roam the mansion that he is employed in, and there are street scenes that you can walk around, but sometimes you basically can walk forwards or backwards and you're playing a cutscene or rewinding a cutscene, and that's kind of it. There are some kind of little ingenious touches, like when you're investigating a crime scene, you can wind back and forward time and reconstitute events as Connor. But yeah, for most players, that could prove jarring, I agree. Finally, I have a question from Sam, who is at Clover_EXE. Sam's a friend of the show and a great streamer. And I say definitely make sure that you go and follow Sam and check out his Twitch presence and Twitch community. Sam says, my question is, if you had to pick one of the two games mentioned in the podcast to live in permanently, which would you choose? And I mean, come on, that's not much of a decision. Who would want to live in that Mad Max world? It's just a nightmare, honestly. I've kind of thought a couple of times, should I be playing this? I tend to not play games that I think are going to negatively affect me in terms of mood or outlook, or kind of rub off on me in negative ways. And Mad Max is horrible. It's just really violent. It's a disgusting vision of the future. It's the most dirty, dusty, grim, post-apocalyptic environment that I think I've seen. You know, everyone is ruined. For some reason, Max is the only one that isn't ruined, and I mean, even he has like a leg brace and scarred and tarred and leathered, and geez, it's the worst. So obviously, I live in Detroit to become human. It's a kind of a near future. I wouldn't even call it a dystopia. The android element suggests dystopia, but it's not really. We don't see that much about what life is like in the future for humans. We mostly see what it's like for androids, but it's a technological future. The world seems to be running kind of okay apart from the arrival of AI. I say that if I was living in the world of Detroit Become Human, I'd be quarantining and self-isolating and watching all of that stuff unfold in the news. So that's the place I'd like to live out of the two. So yeah, thanks for everyone who commented and sent questions and stuff. Thank you for listening to this episode. I really enjoyed playing both of these games. I'm still halfway through Mad Max. I hear that the plot gets heavier towards the second half, so I'm looking forward to that. I will play some of these games on Twitch over the next few days, seeing as I've talked about them here. So please follow me on Twitch at Gaming in the Wild. If you are on Amazon Prime, you can get a free Twitch Prime account and you can subscribe to me, which would make Jeff Bezos give me $5. And I think we can all agree that $5 from Jeff Bezos, we all deserve it probably. But you can activate your Twitch Prime, and I really appreciate subscribes and follows. Also on Twitter and Instagram at Gaming in the Wild. This piece of music that I've been using is a Possum Springs soundtrack from Night in the Woods, game that I recommend heavily and have podcasted about before. So yeah, thank you for listening. Come say hi on Twitter or out there in the internet, and see you next time. Take care. Bye bye.